Please give a warm welcome to Amy Radin.
Thank you so much. So great to be here. Not so easy to pick up the last slot before lunch, but hopefully we'll have a good time. So this is my first trip to Lincoln, Nebraska. I actually grew up in Brooklyn. I know you could not tell that at all from my accent. I grew up in a world that was totally uncool, but as I look back on my upbringing in Brooklyn, what was kind of cool about it was that it was this sort of crazy agglomeration of people from all different backgrounds and communities and neighborhoods somehow falling together, and things worked really well. And as I think back to my early life experiences, there were a couple of things that happened that I went through that were really formative to me, that really shaped my whole philosophy about collaboration and innovation. Incidentally, a word I am also incredibly touchy about, but sort of find unavoidable to use. And one of them was working, frequently being drafted by my dad, who was Harold, to work behind the counter in our family drugstore, along with my 4 siblings. And since we were not members of the union, and all of his other employees were, he could and did prevail upon us to come in whenever he needed us and do anything. And so we would shelve inventory and dust things and wait on customers. And one of the most fun things about it was when you work behind the counter and directly opposite the front door, because you never knew who was going to come through the door and what they were going to ask. And you had about 10 seconds to get ready for them to get from the door to the counter. And his store was kind of a fun place because he sat in the middle of a blue-collar Italian immigrant community where he was the first Jewish merchant, and that was created a whole set of interesting challenges for him, being a merchant there back in the late 1950s, but also served a very large population of Sephardic immigrants from the Middle East who lived along this really amazing Boulevard Ocean Parkway, for those of you who might know Brooklyn, in sort of mansions, except they were packed incredibly close together. So we had a very, very diverse constituency, and we were sort of thrown into the mix, helping them. The other was having the opportunity to attend a big New York City public high school called John Dewey High School. And unlike other schools in the borough, Dewey was zoned for the entire borough, not just for the neighborhood. And so it was also an incredibly diverse population. And it was a school that sort of had big dreams, but grounded in the reality of being, about a half mile from a public housing project and having, again, this incredibly diverse population of people in it. And so I'd run into people, whether in my family's business environment or at school, people who just came from remarkably different backgrounds, who had very different hopes and dreams and experiences than the stuff that I was experiencing, and was really challenged to sort of step out of the shell of this kind of middle-class, upwardly mobile, very sheltered existence that my parents raised me in, and as I look back, had a really big impact upon my whole philosophy of innovation. And so fast forward to a couple of years ago, when after a very long career in the corporate world, sometimes I can't believe how long it was, I at last decided to leave, and really didn't know what I was going to do with myself. But I had this friend, Kevin, who I'd met back in 2010, and he was a journalist and a writer, and he said, after listening to me kind of blabber on and on about why I thought it was so tough to drive innovation in big companies, he said, you should write a book about that. You seem to know a lot about it. And so when I was out of the corporate world, which is a decision I made with no plans, I suddenly had to figure out what to do with myself. And I said, well, maybe I will write that book. And so I started to go around and talk to people I knew who had written business books to get their advice and say, well, is this something I could do and would enjoy doing and be any good at? And kind of the best piece of advice I got was from a colleague of mine who said, Amy, you are never going to make any money on a book. So forget about the economics, which definitely turned out to be true. But write a book for only one reason, and that is if you think you have something to say. And when I heard him say that, I sort of knew, wow, I am in hook, line, and sinker. And what I really wanted to say, and what I ended up saying, is that I really, in my experience and in everything I've seen from the hundreds, if not thousands of innovators I've worked with, innovation gets derailed or diminished, not because of lack of ideas or technology or even capital. There's plenty of money sloshing around. Is that we so often fail to learn and seek out lessons from others, right? And so often the lessons are just hiding in plain sight. And so I really wanted to focus on that and really challenge the assumption that we've got it all nailed. And I think what happens to all of us is so often we are just, we rely on our past experience, we rely on patterns, and patterns are great, but patterns can also lock us in. Or we have very ingrained into us how things are supposed to work. So in doing the research that I did for the book, I really wanted to find some evidence that it really was, that this idea of the lessons are hiding in plain sight really was valid, and that there are things we can do as innovators with our own behavior to really change how we go about doing things, and that by itself could really increase our success. But the thing is, in order to go out and find those lessons, we have to be curious, and curiosity starts with asking questions. And questions like, gee, how'd you come up with that? Or that's amazing. How can we figure out how to make that better? Or what made you think that way? Which are very often the questions we don't ask when we're very much on the road to explaining why that won't work, or I've seen that and done that before. So curiosity is important, and curiosity is strongly correlated to creativity and performance, and no surprise, to innovation. But I came across a study that was published in Harvard Business Review last year that indicated that only 24% of employees are curious about their jobs. I mean, just think about that, 24%. And in another study of several hundred participants, people experience a 20% decrease in curiosity after only 6 months in their job. So if curiosity is manifested in our ability to ask questions and sort of go the next step to learn more, and if it correlates to innovation and creativity and performance, it's sort of like, what are we doing? And I think a lot of it comes down to this willingness to go beyond the obvious, to learn, right? And I see, having kind of, I've sort of bounced back and forth between, I spent many, many years in the corporate world, and the last 5 years spending a lot of time working with early stage startups, advising startups. I've made some angel investments. That what's been remarkably obvious to me is how much they have in common. And even though, big companies like to say, oh, those startups, they get away with murder. They're not accountable for any standards of profitability. They get to do whatever they want. And people in startups say, oh, those big company people, they're dinosaurs. They have no idea what's going on. We're just going to trample them. When it comes right down to it, I really prefer to focus not on what's different and discountable, but on saying, well, the fact that there are differences means maybe there's some answers here that we just haven't really seen. And so that really leads me to today. And what I really want to do here today is share some of what I've seen, some recommendations on what I think startups and big companies can learn from each other. So they really, in the spirit of being more successful and just kind of opening up your curiosity to the fact that there are lessons there. So let's start by talking about big companies, and I've got plenty of evidence as to why they're dinosaurs. I was one of those people who spent a couple of decades inside some incredibly bureaucratic, highly regulated, process-oriented, gigantic companies, trying to be the person, kind of the little engine that could, driving change and innovation. And, we know they're bureaucratic, they are slow. It seemed to me some days, some of the companies that I worked at, most people were paid to say no, not to say yes, and just to kind of keep me from putting the company out of business. That was, I think, the challenge to legions of people who were working in one of the companies I worked at. And they seem to get bogged down in process. As our last speaker said, they focus a lot on the output. Now that, they get paid to apply the rules versus actually achieve impact in the market that's going to help customers. But let's face it, every big company was once a startup. Think about it. They do know how to operate at scale. There is something to be said for predictability. And they are populated with lots and lots of highly talented, skilled people. And because industry employment tends to be a little bit incestuous, they know a lot about the competition, and they have relationships. Sometimes they just need to be pointed in the right direction, and they need some leadership. Startups, they're not burdened with the legacy that comes from, with any kind of bureaucracy that comes from a legacy. They're really fast. They're incredibly resourceful at getting things done. They are passionate about fulfilling their mission and their purpose. But as one of my friends liked to say, a lot of startups may be furiously and passionately barking up the wrong tree. And so that's why I think if you sort of put the two together, there are a lot of ways in which they can help each other out. So let me take you through a few thoughts and recommendations, and I'll start by speaking to the corporate audience, although a lot of the lessons are probably interchangeable. There's this saying that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think big companies are really, really great at, they've got hammers, and they are just pounding away at whatever goal crosses their path. And I think that might be fine if all you're trying to do is keep doing what you've always done. But those hammers can really smother startup companies, which many big companies are quite eager to part with. So my first recommendation is really, you've got to get the tool set that's fit for the purpose of innovation. And a couple of my functions that I love to pick on are, let's take vendor management and procurement. So I remember years ago, one of the first startups whose technology I wanted to license at Citi, I went to procurement, and procurement person called me, and they said, well, we pulled the Dun & Bradstreet report on this company, and you can't work with them because they are losing money. And I'm like, yeah, well, they're a startup, and let's talk about what will happen. This is not a core technology that's running our systems and protecting our consumers from, protecting their money. This was like a really ancillary sort of customer experience improvement. And so you really have to get that fit-for-purpose tool set and put aside the tools that may be great for a scaled business, but they're not going to get you any place when it comes to innovation. In fact, they're going to really slow you down. Metrics is another one. Traditional metrics, we all know, measure short-term financial impact. And so how can those short-term metrics possibly be right for startup measurement? I'm not a fan at all of throwing caution to the wind. I'm a very metric-driven person, but there's different metrics that are necessary to understand your progress at the startup stage, or if you're a big company working with a startup. Now, there was a study done in the last year or two with hundreds of CEOs from diverse companies of all sizes, and amazingly, they reported in aggregate that they were only spending about 3% of their time with customers. Now, this is kind of a tragic result, especially when I'm willing to bet that most of these same CEOs were out telling their people that they needed to put the customer at the center of everything they do. So, really? I would say, startups, those of you who are startups know this, don't have money for fancy market research studies or syndicated subscriptions, and don't have big customer service units who can filter and aggregate and compile beautiful PowerPoint reports to send to management about what the customer is saying and thinking. That's why the better founders are out in the market meeting with their customers and prospects in their environment, on their turf. And I'd say if you're not doing that, whether you're a startup or a big company, very hard to progress your innovation agenda. It is just so different to actually be in the customer's environment and just say very little, listen a lot. It will really be game-changing. If you're going to be a corporate innovator, part of the job is the job becomes really running the bureaucracy. And I've just been amazed at how differently, I think for me, one of the big eye-openers when I stepped out of the corporate world and started to work with startups, how different the assumptions are about how much money, how much time, how many people it takes to accomplish a task versus when you're trying to drive innovation in a big company. It's just refreshing. They just don't have the resources, and are forced to prioritize. And prioritize, I don't mean do the corporate thing of just taking items 1 to 1,000 and rearranging them, but it's really saying, what are the top 5 or 6 that we can really do well, and how do we really do them to make something happen? Really, really important. It's just part of the job, and anybody who's trying to be a corporate innovator who submits to the bureaucracy will surely have a very hard time succeeding. So let's turn for a couple of minutes to startups. And I talk to a lot of founders, and big red flag comes up when founder says to me, well, we're not ready for marketing. Now, marketing is not advertising, and it's not a communications function. So, before you assume that it's too early for marketing or you don't need marketing, please go and find out what a real chief marketing officer does. It's a really serious role, and somebody with a great marketing skill set, whether they have that title or not, are going to help you figure out who your customer is, really help you listen to understand what their needs are, and then collaborate with the rest of the organization to figure out not just how to do communications, but how to actually engineer product and experience and policies and everything else that the organization is doing so that you really are aiming to understand, as I said, understand the market and meet people's true needs and build a business that makes sense. And I think a lot of startups sell themselves short, where they discount or defer the value of and the role of having some strategic marketing capability in their organization at the right time. Next, I think that most startups never have the opportunity to think about scaling. But for those who do, I think the leadership team has to start to embrace early on the fact that as you move on to the path to scaling, your core product as a leadership team is making decisions, especially decisions about how to attract talent, how to set them up for success, how to take risk without the constant need, without killing the business, and embracing the fact that there is constantly going to need to take risk. And you may be in the position of having validated that there's a market need and a market fit and people want what you buy, and if you don't make this turn as a leadership team, you can still fail, or your investors will remove you. And I've seen that happen lots of times as well. Finally, I find a lot of startups, and maybe this is more at the earlier stage because it's where I spend a lot of my time, seem to sort of revel in the messiness of it all. And I worked for a CEO years ago. He was actually my CEO at American Express for a number of years, who really taught the organization that process can be very empowering and liberating. And good process actually frees you up to do the fun stuff and do the things that really add value and make a difference. And I think sometimes in the startup world, people hear the word process and automatically associate it with bureaucracy. And I think process is only cumbersome when it's engineered for internal control versus facilitating giving customers what they want, or when it's actually sort of one of those hammers in disguise treating everything like nails. So I think getting to the right process that's really facilitating what customers need is something that many startups could do a little bit more of. Finally, and I was so happy that some of our speakers talked about this already today, I'd like to see more startups build products that solve real problems. I think there's too many startups out there that are solving trivial problems on the margin that don't really meet market needs or that aren't really problems at all. And as I said, I make angel investments, so I really want to get that return. I want that valuation increase. I want my money out. But it's still very, very frustrating to see that there's a lot of startups doing things that are trading off all the other stakeholders for investor returns. And I think, we can have a long discussion about why that happens. I think there's a need for innovation in the investment model itself. I certainly don't have the answers, but I think it's just really, I think we will all be better off if we really focus on how do we solve real problems, and building feasible business models and execution systems that can turn into real businesses. Finally, I've been out there for a while. I'm a boomer, or as I'm still trying to convince my children, a millennial inside the body of a boomer. And I think the world, there's no shortage of opportunity. It seems so cliche. There's so much that we can do as innovators, and I think that's why I've stayed in the game for these last 5 years, and why I have just been unwilling to turn my back on the fact that the expertise I've developed around execution and how do you really motor through and get it done is really important to share. But I've seen too many situations where there are great people who are discounted or not listened to, or ideas that are discounted or not listened to, because they don't fit our frame of reference, because they're not just like us. And I think those among you who've had the opportunity to experience the value that diverse thinking and people who are bringing different education backgrounds, different life experiences, different functional experiences, even the stuff that's very non-obvious, those of you who've seen the value that that can provide have a real opportunity to encourage and stimulate that in others. I hold it as a key success factor for all of us to succeed. Finally, I guess the literature major in me loves looking at the origin of words. And I think one of our big innovation challenges is just a lack of courage in the world. Courage has as its Latin root the word cor, for heart, and also is almost identical to the Old French word for heart. And I think innovation it's not just about the technical skill, it's not just about the money, it's about the courage of head and heart, the ability and the desire to persist and really make a difference. And it's really my belief that casting that wide and not obvious net is really critical for all of us to build that strength as innovators. So thank you, and happy to take some questions. Yes. And just speak up, because I might not be able to hear you.
Hi.
You're getting the box.
Spoke about this, about their job. What does that actually look like?
I think it's asking questions. And none of us want to be, I don't think, that person in the room who's just asking questions to hound and ask questions. But I can remember many times when, because I'm like a natural dot connector and question asker, because I get excited about possibilities. And I know there were many times when my colleagues in the corporate world thought that I was wasting time by asking questions that could have gotten us to better connections and answers. So I think a big piece of curiosity, and it starts with listening. I think we all think about, we tend to think about communications as speaking, but there's a quote from an ancient Greek philosopher: we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we can listen twice as much as we talk. So I think a lot of it is listening and resisting that urge to sort of check out, or say, like, that'll never work, we've tried that before, all the variations on that theme. What I say, and this is a trick I developed I've heard hundreds of angel pitches, and the first thing you want to do with a founder is sort of smoke out the bullshit and say, is this really for real? And so one of my favorite all-purpose questions is, can you tell me more about that? So, just that simple question, can you tell me more about that, before, usually you're going to peel back a layer of the onion and find that one of the assumptions you were making in your head is not right at all. So you just go, tell me a little more about that, or wow, how'd you think of that, or what do you think, what can we do next? So almost any open-ended question like that is going to get you to something surprising and helpful, and it's just very interesting, versus trying to tell them why you were right or sharing your expertise. Another question? Do you have the box?
I have the box. Now the box is working. I have 72 questions, but I'm going to start with one. Do you have any tips for teaching people to be curious, either within a setting or over a career? I find that people, at some point, and for some people it's very young, they think that their job is to teach instead of to learn in any meeting that they're in any setting that they're in, and it's...
I have a 14-year-old at home, so I'm stressed out on that topic.
Yeah.
I'm stressed out on that topic every day. I think what happens, you think, why is it that people don't ask the follow-on question, or why are we all in such a rush? And I think there's a big issue around, are you creating an environment or role modeling cultural conditions where people are comfortable asking questions. Because asking a question, you're sort of admitting that you don't know something. And so I think that asking questions and admitting, I mean, I'm like really happy to admit that I don't know things. I think asking questions is a sign of courage. So I would say, are you creating an environment or role modeling or contributing to an environment where people feel not just safe, but appreciate the value of asking questions? I have a friend who has his own innovation consultancy, and he does this exercise with his team where they spend an hour a week just asking questions. So he has kind of this forced exercise, but it's really instilled upon his group. First of all, nobody wants to come and work there if they think that's goofy. So those sorts of things become really good filters in the recruiting process. You automatically sort of figure out who values it and who thinks it's silly. But it's almost like exercising a muscle, and they just ask questions for an hour, no answers. Just it. So I think he's found that to be a really helpful, specific technique, and it sort of conditions everybody when they go out into the field and work with clients to become much better listeners and question askers too. Hopefully that helps. Another question? One more?
We're there. There you go.
So, I'm curious, what's some questions that you would recommend we ask investors? For example, like my company, I'm really focused on long-term impact of what we're doing, working with some very sensitive information. I'm curious, what are some questions you would ask to allow my team to understand the motivations of an investor beyond quarterly returns and short-term goals?
Wait, I'm not sure I understood your question. Did you?
Yeah, so you said you want to know how to ask investors questions, or what questions you should be asking investors to get better feel for what their motivations behind them, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there's a lot of bad money out there. And I would definitely, I have a friend who's just starting a managed angel fund, and I've spoken to him a lot about this kind of thing, and he is astounded in general at how little due diligence founders do on investors. So, big topic, and I'd say, talk to other founders who have taken money from those investors around what the experience is like. Because I really do think on one level, talk is cheap and behavior is everything. So asking people, even in an interview for hire, I know, like, what would you do? Or what do you think of this? I mean, those are kind of marginally interesting, but I'd rather ask, tell me about a time when, or tell me about what is your meeting process with founders? What is your mentoring approach? Tell me about a situation where you had to help a founder do X. And the more specific and situational you can get, the more you sort of say, is this for real, or are they just spouting the philosophy, but actually, as soon as they think you're not one of their winners, you're not going to get any attention. So I learned when I was at Amex years ago, when I was working for American Express, they had an incredible leadership development program, and we had training in what's called competency-based interviewing, and I don't know if but it's all about asking questions along the line of, tell me about a time when, that get to the things you really want to understand. So figure out your 3 tell me about a time when questions, and I would ask the investors, but I would also ask to meet founders who have taken their money.
Great stuff. Great stuff. All right, Amy, thank you very much. Let's give her a big hand.